Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of the JAGNES conference, the Journal of Associated Graduates of Near Eastern Studies, centered at UC Berkeley's Near Eastern Studies Department. My name is Jess Johnson, and I'm one of the new transitioning editor-in-chiefs, along with Jenna Stover-Kemp, who's here with me on the screen. Today, we're happy to present to you our second panel. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today and our attendees as well. Feel free to say hi and tell us where you're from in the chat. As a brief overview, this session will go from 2 to 4:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Each talk will be about 20 minutes, followed directly by a 5-minute question and answer. There will be no question and answer at the end of the entire session. The chat will also be disabled during the lectures so as not to distract the panelists. So if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature in Zoom. If you want to learn more about JAGNES events and our publications, please see our website at jagnesjournal.wordpress.com, and you can also follow us on Facebook. So without further ado, let us get started by introducing our moderator for today, Madeline Weiss. Madeline is a doctoral student in Islamic and Rabbinic Studies at UC Berkeley. She's interested in how sacred texts have been read as law and as literature. Her work examines the theories of language and intertextuality at play in texts from Usul al-Fiqh to Tafsir, Talmud to Agadic Midrash. We'd like to thank Madeline for her time and ask that you give her your undivided attention.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited about this panel of presentations that we have today, ranging from law to literature and spanning the many different linguistic and cultural centers of the Middle East. Our first talk will be by Adam Matvey. Adam Matvey is a recent graduate of the University of Chicago's Middle Eastern Studies Master's Program. He wrote his MA thesis on the jurisprudential program of the 18th century Indian scholar Shah Wali Allah and its reception in Deobandi thought. His paper today is entitled Between Delegation and Disagreement on Hadith and the Inter-Madhab Flexibility in the Commentaries of Abdul Fattah Abū Ghuddah. Please, well, I can't say please join me in welcoming because we cannot hear your applause, but please applaud loudly in your own living rooms for Adam Matvey's talk. Oh.
Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I want to thank the Journal of Associated Graduates in Near Eastern Studies at UC Berkeley, first of all, for holding this event. I'm excited and thankful for the opportunity. Today, I will be presenting on the 20th century Syrian scholar, Abū Ghuddah, and his editorial engagements with a modern South Asian reform movement called the DEOBAND, specifically as it relates to the issue of taqlid or precedent in Islamic law following the schools of jurisprudence, the madhahib, and Hanafi hadith literature. These are hot button issues in Salafi traditionalist debates, so I hope to illustrate how certain transregional networks between the Middle East and South Asia form around these sensitivities. The issue of taqlid in modern juristic thought has been transformed by new discourses on authority, scripture, and legal hermeneutics. Among the classical disputations on taqlid is Alam al-Muwaqqi'in al-Rabb al-Alamin by 14th century Hanbali jurisconsult Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya. The work is centered on fatwa giving, but includes a famous exposition on taqlid that has been the subject of modern rebuttals. Contemporary debates on madhab following have adhered to a strict taqlid ijtihad dichotomy, but this schema has been increasingly problematized in the secondary literature. So what is at the root of modern sensitivities over taqlid? This paper highlights the figure of Syrian Hanafi hadith scholar Abū Ghuddah and his extensive editorial engagements with the Deoband school in South Asia. Through analysis of Abū Ghuddah's scholastic legacy, involving mostly annotations, edits, and commentaries of other Hanafi texts, I argue that the key to modern defenses of Hanafi taqlid is hadith. These defenses are waged using arguably unchanged classical hermeneutical structures, but crucially through new media and literary genres and manuscript printing. The role of the editor cum scholar shows how classical manuscripts become imbued with interpretive strategies and proclivities of editors and publishing houses in print editions. Ahmed Khan shows how transregional networks form around editorial strategies, and how footnotes, monographs, and other specialized mediums act as a vehicle of authority, but also as sites of defense against anti-madhab Salafi modernist criticism. Following Muhammad Qasim Zaman's work on commentaries as a discursive trans-historical medium, this paper shows how traditional authority structures were articulated and disseminated globally through the Aleppo Hadith scene led by Abū Ghuddah and a revived Hanafi hermeneutical project. Recent academic works on taqlid have been reshaped by a series of correctives in the secondary literature. These reparative works demonstrate how taqlid is not mere blind precedent following, but rather can be construed as a dynamic legal form that reconciles precedent with legal reasoning. Precedent in the common law tradition, of course, being traditionally viewed as antagonistic to Islamic law. There is something to be gained by acknowledging the sheer practicality and inevitability of precedent in jurisprudence. In his introduction to Ibn Rushd's 12th century manual on Islamic law, the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, Imran Ehsan Khan Niazi defines taqlid as follows. Taqlid, as distinguished from blind conservatism, is the foundation of all relationships based on trust, like those between a patient and his doctor, a client and his lawyer, and a business and its accountant. It is the legal method for ensuring that judges who are not fully qualified mujtahids may be able to decide cases in light of precedents laid down by independent jurists. It is similar to the case of a subordinate court following the precedent established by a higher court. Niazi's use of the doctor-patient or lawyer-client analogy is a common one in taqlid defenses. Deobandi jurist and close friend of Abū Ghuddah, Taqi Usmani, conceptualizes taqlid as the obligation to follow expertise as in any area that requires authority. Meanwhile, Habib Ahmed al-Qaranvi, in a refutation of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya's Alam al-Muwaqqi'in, notes that all proofs are based on some version of taqlid. Al-Qaranvi's treatise is significant for two reasons. First, it is an introduction to Zafar Ahmed Usmani's 22-volume compendium of Hanafi hadith proofs, the Ila as-Sunan. The very association of this pro-taqlid treatise with a prized Hanafi hadith work underscores a core sensitivity in the Hanafi school, perceived weakness in hadith. Second, Al-Qaranvi's treatise is one of three introductions to the Usmani compendium. The other one is a biography of Zafar Ahmed Usmani by Abū Ghuddah, which is a reprinted introduction from Usmani's work on Hadith science, Qawaid fil Ulum al-Hadith. The Abū Ghuddah edition shows the extent to which the Syrian traditionalist was involved in Deobandi scholarship and the cross-regional impact of Deobandi literary productions, which represent the culmination of 2 centuries of reform and rectification in Indian Hadith study. The inaugurator of India's Hadith Renaissance was 18th century reviver or Mujaddid SHAH Wali, and one of his monumental juristic treatises, Al-Insafi Bayan Sabab al-Ikhtilaf, the paradigmatic Indian scholar cited various reasons for the development of the madhab. Among them are the sheer quantity of cases, precedents, proofs, and subcategories that require superior knowledge. Moreover, he asserts that such a large volume of precedents mandates that they be systematically followed, and any effort to repeatedly scrutinize them would be a never-ending task. One final but critical reason cited is that knowledge of every hadith transmitter and all hadith classifications and subclassifications are simply too great a burden. So again, we see how it's an issue of practicality. SHAH Wali's jurisprudential program is critical to the development of the Deoband school, upon which Abū Ghuddah held great affinities. But SHAH Wali's discourse on taqlid and ijtihad and strict scriptural hermeneutics was also formative for modern Salafi movements which weaponized a scripture-only approach in direct, unmediated textual engagement. In India, the Shah school split into two factions, the late traditionalists as represented by the DEOBAND, and the proto-Salafi movement, the Ahl Hadith. This ideological fracturing dovetails with divisions in Islamic intellectual currents in the Middle East, represented by Abū Ghuddah and reformist Salafis. But crucially, this intellectual conflict also manifests in trans-regional editing and print strategies involving Middle Eastern and South Asian publishing houses, institutions, and print presses. Methodologically, we might identify the Salafi approach as veritable following, or ittiba', which Ahmed Fakhri Ibrahim has traced to the immediate post-Hanbal period. Crucially, the taqlid ittiba' distinction is central to Salafi methods which prioritize exclusive scriptural recourse. The implications of this methodology are both socially and politically explosive, as it bypasses scholarly mediation, potentially, and subverts traditional authority structures. While what we call veritable following as opposed to precedent following as a textual method is not new, nor are the attacks on Hanafi Hadith credentials, waning trust in jurisprudential institutions gave these renewed Salafi attacks a kind of augmented salience in the not possible or not located in the medieval period. One important traditionalist defender of the madhab was Muhammad Sayyid Ramadan al-Buti, who also rejected a sharp taqlid ittiba' binary. Al-Buti became infamous for his pro-Assad stance during the Syrian civil war, but is considered a Shafi'i mujtahid par excellence. While he does uphold a standard taqlid and ijtihad binary, his text, Alam Madhabiyya, is a direct refutation of anti-madhab ideology. Later, Al-Buti cites Shams al-Din al-Dhahabi's Bayan Zaghal al-Ilm to warn against considering one's madhab superior or even God's preferred madhab. He cites the hadith-based legal maxim that an incorrect interpretation receives one reward, while a correct interpretation receives two rewards. The political aspect of al-Buti's legacy is beyond the scope of this paper, but it is important to note that the regime's, as in the Assad regime's co-optation of al-Buti was hugely significant. As Thomas Pray notes, the Syrian Ba'ath Party did not have the institutional capacity to create what he calls an organic, state-pliant Ba'athist clergy. But the regime's strategy to co-opt existing clerical networks was based on a core reality of Syria's post-1980s religious landscape, acute geographic fragmentation. One testament to this fragmentation is how biographical dictionaries of Syrian scholars were organized by cities, which is rare in hagiographical literature. The reason for this fragmentation is twofold. First, the old Ottoman religious dynasties became extinct in the late 19th, early 20th century with the rise of secular education and new political opportunities. This gave rise to a new clerical class and new private learning centers. And these centers were often based on Sufi authority structures and rural-based, which is the traditional stronghold of the Shafi'i school in Syria. These institutions replaced Ottoman-era urban-based Hanafi networks, leading to a mild resurgence of the Shafi'i school, especially in Damascus. Importantly, all three Grand Muftis in Syria since 1963 have been Shafi'i. The second reason for fragmentation is that there was a split in the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in the 1960s between the Damascus branch led by former Supreme Guide Issam al-Attar and the Egyptian-backed Aleppo branch. One of the most belligerent anti-madhab Salafi voices in Syria in the 20th century was Nasir al-Din al-Albani. Al-Albani took advantage of the gradual rise of Salafism in Syria, starting a regular column for the Salafi Club and academic journal Al-Tamaddun al-Islami, and regularly attended Muslim Brotherhood meetings in Damascus in the 1950s. Following the Brotherhood's internal split, academic disputes raged between the Aleppo branch and the Damascus Salafis, like with al-Albani and Aleppo-based Abū Ghuddah at the forefront. Again, there is extremely important context for understanding the Salafi Abū Ghuddah debates in 20th century Syria. The core Salafi criticism against the Hanafi school to which Abū Ghuddah belonged is the centuries-old claim that Hanafis are weak in hadith. Thomas Prey notes that the death of supreme hadith scholar Badr al-Din al-Hassani in 1935 led to a sustained decline in Damascus hadith scholarship. Not until the 21st century did Damascus experience a significant uptick in hadith study, in part due to Salafi metastasization and interregional competition. In fact, public recitations of hadith in Damascus, a centuries-old practice, would often start by criticizing Salafi scholars, like al-Albani, thus illustrating the clerical sensitivities over authority and popular learning. Meanwhile, in 20th century Aleppo, hadith study flourished. In fact, three of the most prominent anti-Salafi hadith scholars came from Aleppo: Abdullah Siraj al-Din, who was the founder of the Hanafi Shabaniya institution, Nur al-Din al-Ittar, and Abū Ghuddah. Abū Ghuddah's bibliography totals around 70 works, but less than half of these are original compositions. Taqi Usmani, the Deobandi, makes the interesting remark that there was greater benefit carried by Abū Ghuddah's large number of commentaries, edits, and annotations. It is the precise lack of independence and close association to the scholarly forefathers that gave Abū Ghuddah satisfaction. Should taqlid be construed as what George Makdisi called servile imitation, or is a taqlid regime equally grounded in issues of authority, etiquette, and cultural memory? In an original composition titled Qimat al-Zaman, The Value of Time, Abū Ghuddah praises the time management skills of various scholars, including anti-taqlid scholars like Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah. Abū Ghuddah's treatise is animated by what he perceives as intellectual laziness among contemporary students. Rather than imitation, a taqlidist ethos here is symbolized by a reverence for the Islamic textual tradition. Therefore, the traditionalist program is one that views the acquisition of knowledge as a laborious but fallible process that requires scholarly mediation and contestation, but with no claims to objective truth. This conceptualization of the canon can be extended to Ayub Said Kaya's definition of the madhab as a legacy-bound form of legal reasoning, or a discourse rooted in the legacy of the eponym, but a dynamic one of continuity and reconfiguration. He refers to this as intra-madhabic reasoning. In other words, hermeneutical flexibility through legacy as a discourse that creates a framework of reasoning, perhaps not dissimilar to what Gadamer referred to as a fusing of horizons, or the inescapable hermeneutic situation. In these articulations, taqlid, madhab, and legacy are not necessarily conflated, but entwined in a common discourse and projection of authority. Ahmed Khan draws on Jan Osman's theory of cultural memory as a schema for understanding madhab affiliation, which he conceptualizes as a memory structure. The example that Khan uses is Zafar Ahmad Usmani's own introduction to the Ilal Sunan. This introduction is essentially a prosopography of 264 Hanafi hadith scholars, but also an implicit rejoinder to Salafi criticism. Similarly, Abū Ghuddah's edit of Makanat al-Imam Abi Hanifa fi hadith by Deobandi Muhammad Abdul Rashid al-Numani is animated by the same sensitivity. Abū Ghuddah writes in the introduction that many non-Hanafis wrote defenses of Abu Hanifa, including Shams al-Din al-Dhahbi, who is Shafi, Yusuf bin Hassan bin Abd al-Hadi, who is Hanbali, and Ibn Abd al-Bar, who is Maliki. He proceeds to highlight the disease in the Arab world to belittle Abu Hanifa in hadith, and the makanat is a response to this irritation, or tawish. In this treatise, al-Numani places particular emphasis on how Salafis manipulate the books of criticism and approval for transmitter evaluation in hadith science to slander the eponyms, in particular Abu Hanifa. One such scholar is none other than Nasir ad-Din al-Albani, who ignores the mainstream approach in hagiographies to ignore the denigrating accounts of Abu Hanifa. One famous entry is from Shafi jurist al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, which, while ignored in most hagiographical literature, has been resuscitated by modern Salafis to denounce Hanafis and the transmitter criticism genre. Not coincidentally, al-Numani gives great emphasis to the sub-branch before labeling al-Albani a zealot or mutassib who systematically ignores the canon. Al-Numani's Makanet, edited by Abū Ghuddah, utilizes two of the preferred genres highlighted by Ahmed Khan from Madhab defenses, the monograph and transmitter criticism. Among the most prominent users of the monograph are Deobandi Hadith scholars such as Al-Numani, Abdul Hayy al-Lakhnawi, and Anwar Shah Kashmiri, all of whose Hadith scholarship in India has been transmitted to Middle Eastern networks by Abū Ghuddah. The genre of transmitter criticism, meanwhile, has long been a preferred medium for Salafis, but was appropriated by Deobandi traditionalists in counter-polemics. One example of a Deobandi primer and Rijal criticism is Abdul Hayy al-Lakhnawi's Al-Rafa' wal-Takmil, which was edited by Abū Ghuddah. Like Al-Numani, al-Lakhnawi appropriates Salafi criticisms by using their own terminology, such as the favored Salafi insult mutasib. He also cleverly cites two Hanbali refutations of the Khatib al-Baghdadi entry on Abu Hanifa. In summary, through al-Lakhnawi's use of Rijal criticism and Abū Ghuddah's role in its production, we see how new genres of literature are weaponized in hermeneutical defenses and the trans-regional networks that form around editorial strategies. As with the monograph and commentary, we might further consider narrator criticism, a new site upon which clerical authority is reconstituted and rearticulated. One impetus for these print strategies is the quasi-democratic hermeneutics brought on in the Salafi modernist onslaught. Ahmed Khan refers to this as a new kind of interpretive agency over the classical texts, stemming from 19th and 20th century manuscript printing. One of the more illuminating examples of what Khan refers to as a post-edition polemic is al-Albani's edition of Ibn al-Izz al-Hanafi's commentary on Al-Aqidah al-Tahawiyah. Al-Aqidah is a popular theological exposition by the Abbasid-era Hanafi jurist al-Tahawi. Al-Albani would have been aware of Tahawi's role in realigning the Hanafi madhab with post-traditionalist hadith standards. In India, the Hanafi school underwent what one might call a second traditionalization, that is a reorientation towards hadith in Hanafi thought since the late medieval period. And while Ibn al-Izz al-Hanafi's commentary largely concerns speculative theology, al-Albani uses the post-edition to attack two Hanafi scholars, Abū Ghuddah and Muhammad Zahid al-Qathili, former adjunct to the last Sheikh of Islam of the Ottoman Empire and Abū Ghuddah's teacher. In his 40-page introduction, al-Albani offers very little on the actual subject of the commentary, instead offering page after page of invective against the Hanafi scholars. Specifically, al-Albani targets the methods of contemporary traditionalist Hanafis in their manipulation of hadith science. On al-Qathili, al-Albani actually acknowledges his credentials in hadith science, which makes al-Qathili's Hanafi fanaticism all the worse. That's his word. Abū Ghuddah no doubt enjoyed a close relationship with al-Qathili. Prominent Saudi Salafi polemicist Bakr Abu Zayd referred to the Syrian scholar as Little Qathili, al-Qathili al-Saghir, and lambasted him for his role in al-Lakhnawi's Al-Rafa' wal-Takmil. Abū Ghuddah was not reticent about the nature of this relationship. He received his cognomen Abdul Fattah from Qathili and also named his son Muhammad Zahid in his teacher's honor. But as made clear by Taqi Usmani, Abū Ghuddah was known to disagree with his mentor not infrequently. Usmani writes, "We can disagree with al-Qathili as any other scholar, including in his methods and positions, but our duty is to defend the ulama." Usmani proceeds to explain how disagreement is part of the scholarly discourse and that proper etiquette for the ulama is to confine these discourse differences to the scholarly domain. Interestingly, he alludes to academic differences that the Deoband have with Salafi scholars, but stresses open dialogue and good temperament. Usmani's conceptualization of disagreement as a matter of etiquette helps situate Abū Ghuddah and other late traditionalist scholars within Kai's legacy paradigm or Khan's use of cultural memory. Taqlid or precedent following is a matter of respecting the scholarly tradition. The Islamic legal canon, however, is constituted by a diversity of interpretations represented by the four schools of jurisprudence. There is a theological dimension to how traditionalists and Salafis reconcile this fact. Traditionalists like Abū Ghuddah and the Deoband defend Taqlid on the grounds that an objectively true interpretation is impossible. Standard Ash'ari theology, for instance, hold that God does not have an objective. Theoretically, this lack of limitation in interpretive possibility makes the job of a jurist easier. This is not to suggest that the classical or traditionalist scholars advocate a radically democratic hermeneutics, as one might find in post-Reformation Christianity, but rather that each madhab sets the parameters of discourse in the interpretive act. allowing for hermeneutically sound but not objectively true interpretations. As the famous Islamic legal maxim states, every mujtahid is correct. Mujtahid musib. In this way, defenders of taqlid are actually defending interpretive multiplicity, while also recognizing that each madhab contains a hermeneutical structure to how opinions are formed. If one's opinion is adopted and another is rejected, the integrity of that structure is compromised. Contrarily, anti-taqlid jurists like Ibn Qayyim and modern Salafis argue for complete objectivity in the Quran. As made explicit in Deobandi literature and in Abū Ghuddah's kalimat, intra-madhab disagreement is entirely possible, but for traditionalist Hanafis, the madhab's contemporary authority is validated through rectification of hadith study, as evidenced in the various treatises, monographs, and Rajal literature surveyed here. Crucially, for this paper's argument, Abū Ghuddah traveled to South Asia to research manuscripts at Deobandi libraries and to build relationships with the various Indian and Pakistani hadith scholars at the behest of his teacher, Al-Qathari. However, we might find Shah Wali's doctrine of tatbiq or harmonization relevant here. Shah Wali was overwhelmingly focused on harmonizing the works of jurisconsults, the fuqaha, with hadith scholars. This paper argues that Abū Ghuddah and Al-Qathari can be seen as the Levantine version of the Indian traditionalists, reconcilers of hadith and Hanafi jurisprudence and defenders of taqlid in the spirit of Shah Wali's tatbiq. In this articulation, taqlid should be viewed through the lens of scholarly etiquette and tolerance for disagreement, two key modules in Shah Wali's integrationist program. I argue that this program, Maslak, is the key to the Deoband-Shah Wali relationship, but is also located in editorial strategies and productions of Abū Ghuddah and the late traditionalist Hanafis.
Thank you so much for that very erudite and thought-provoking talk, Adam. I'd like to start a first question that I had while I was listening to your talk. You look at a number of different ways that genres, both traditional genres of commentary as well as of genres that are marked by developments of the print culture, by things like footnotes and editorial introductions, as well as the monograph, play a role in the emergence of these two schools of thought and two approaches to taqlid. Could you talk a little bit more? I know there's been a lot of very interesting scholarship. Actually, one of our professors, Asad Ahmed at Berkeley, just wrote on the role of the commentary in the logic tradition, and that we should not overlook the power of some of these traditional genres as a place where really important debates play out and unfold. Could you talk a little bit more about the roles of those different genres in the dynamics that you're seeing?
Yeah, of course. I think it's interesting. It's why I think that it's sort of fruitful to sort of in the modern period, like I said, taqlid and following schools of jurisprudence, it becomes tied to new issues of authority in a fractured sort of scholarly landscape. We have competing legal systems, we have competing educational systems. And so in many ways in the Deobandi literature that I read, and I came to Abū Ghuddah through the Deobandis, not the reverse. In many ways, I think that like the commentary and different new genres in which they defend their madhab credentials in hadith is simply a way to reassert their authority. And so I think in Abū Ghuddah's works in particular, this notion that most of his compositions aren't original works and that there is actually greater benefit to just being tied to the sort of intellectual predecessors of the Hanafi school carries greater benefit. But I'm not sure if that dynamic existed in the pre-modern period because these issues of authority weren't as present.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any more questions popping up in the chat, and it is officially time for our next talk, but thank you again, Adam, for that really fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Amanda Katerina Leong. Amanda is a third-year PhD student in the interdisciplinary humanities at UC Merced, with a main field in Middle East studies and a subfield in medical humanities. Her work looks at the ways early modern women were central to defining notions of power, ethics, and cosmopolitanism that shaped the Mughal and Safavid empires, as well as the way that public health and disease were presented by Qajar women. She has also written for publications including Ajam Media Collective and Iran Wire. Today, Amanda will be presenting a paper entitled Contesting Patriarchal Kingship, the Humayunama as a Mirror for Princesses. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here. So my topic today is going to be Contesting Patriarchal Kingship, the Humayuname as a Mirror for Princesses. So first of all, I want to give a brief introduction of the Humayuname. So the Humayuname is written by Gulbadan Begum, and it's written in Persian, which is the Muslim language of the subcontinent at that time, and it's translated to English by W.M. Thaxton. So the central plot line is basically, the struggle for kingship between Emperor Humayun and his half-brother Mirza Hamran after the death of their father, Emperor Babur. So Gulbadan Begum is actually a Mughal princess, and she's highly educated. She's the daughter of Emperor Babur, who's the founder of the Mughal Empire, and she wrote the Humayuname when she was 65 on the request of her nephew, Emperor Akbar, to recall events of her father, Babur, and brother, Emperor Humayun, because unlike Babur or Akbar, Emperor Humayun did not write his own autobiography. So my argument is that the Humayuname informs readers the ways elite Mughal women use autobiographical writing to showcase the power they had over their male co-sovereigns. So you might be wondering, how so? So they did it by combining memory narratives and historical facts to create a new mirror for princesses, autobiographical genre that redefines the adab or mirror for princess tradition. And with that, she's able to convey how elite Mughal women embodied characteristics of kingship. So you might be wondering, what did she manage to achieve by doing so? So by creating the Humayuname as a mirror for princesses, she's able to instruct both female and male readers the methods Mughal women covertly and overtly used to participate in various political activities. With that, the Mughal Empire is now redefined as integrated matriarchy. So why are Mughal women important but forgotten? So Mughal women are important because they are seen as, a descendant from the mythical sun goddess Alangoa that belonged to the lineage of Genghis Khan. And it was only women who supplied the legitimacy needed for Mughal sovereignty. So only those descended from the royal lineage of Genghis Khan and the sun goddess Alangoa could hold legitimate power. And they're forgotten because dominant narratives regarding the Mughal rule came from narratives written by early Europeans in the Mughal court. So because the Mughals saw Europeans as being unclean and grasping, bearing mean and paltry gifts, as a result, they were not able to gain access to the culture of the Mughal courts, and they were unable to understand Mughal women's influence and power. So to fill in this lack, they decided to, create what we all know, which is the Orientalist harem. Okay, and so since I come from an interdisciplinary program, I'm very much interested in using a theoretical, approach when it comes to analyzing, history. So I'm using Michel Foucault's theory of counter history. So I argue that Foucault basically argues that counter history has the power to destabilize a dominant ideology by introducing a counter perspective that challenges normative expectation. So how does the Humayuname function as a form of counter history? So by using conventional mirror for princess tactics and innovative narrative strategies, that is a combination of memory and history, Gulbadan Begum is able to create a new mirror for princesses that invites us to remember Mughal women in ways that are not wholly dominated by masculine or Orientalist discourses of Mughal history, because Mughal history is normally seen, for example, if we think of Mughal kingship, we normally think of a very patriarchal government, but here she challenges this idea. So a bit of background on the mirror for princess. According to the Islamic tradition, it's very much part of adab literature, and the aim is to, teach future rulers methods of being, methods of practices to become a good king. So ideally, a ruler should be able to maintain harmonious social order. He should practice cardinal virtues. He should, consult with the right advisors, avoid, ostentation, spending too much, and, enforce justice by attending to the material well-being of his subjects. So the conventional structure for mirror for princess normally begins with a profession of humility and insistence of the author's lack of qualifications. So the author has to balance praise with counsel and to learn how to convey subtle critiques through their choice of quotations and their presentation of examples. So here in the blue highlighted part of the text, I'm going to show you how she in a way adheres to the mirror for princess tradition. So there's an example that is the beginning of the Humayun-Nameh. So Gulbadan begins by writing about when His Majesty Firdaus Makhani departed from this mortal world for the realm of eternity. This poor one was 8 years old, and events may not have remained so well in my memory. In obedience to the royal order, however, what I heard and remember will be written. At the beginning of this session, what will be recorded the career of my father, His Majesty the Padishah. Although these things are recorded in my father's, the Padishah's memoirs, for the sake of auspiciousness and good luck, they were written here. So, from what you can see in the blue highlighted part, by calling herself the poor one and telling us that she's just, writing to obey a royal order, she's basically just using a rhetorical convention to meet expectations and gain acceptance from the Mughal court. But she defies these expectations. For example, she calls the king Padishah Baban, my father the king. This is something that, chroniclers were not able to call the king, because they had to call the king in a more respectful manner, right? And she also combines memory and history to form some sort of counter history to make the forgotten actions of elite Mughal women not only hurt, but are in fact the force behind shaping the decisions made by their male counterparts. And with this, she's able to communicate the influence they had over Mughal males. And another thing she used to defy our expectations is characterization. So Gulbadan's characters actually enforce a specific code of honor, which is the Persianate ethical idea of Javan Mar. In English, we can translate it to youth, manliness, or chivalry. So what does it mean to be Javan Mardi? It means you have to embody characteristics of sacrifice, courage, prowess, and honesty. So with the Humayun-Nameh as a mirror for princesses, she seeks to encourage Mughal women to practice various activities and virtues traditionally associated with men, so that they are able to live up to the royal lineages. And so just like Mughal men, they can become able rulers. So one of the characters she talks about that embodies sacrifice is Hanzada Begum. So Hanzada Begum is the elder sister of Babur and also the aunt of Gulbadan. So she's described in this manner. When no aid or assistance was forthcoming from any quarter, Babur despaired. At such a time, Shahi Beghan Khan sent a message saying, if you marry your sister Hanzada Begim to me, there will be peace between us and you, and a relationship of unity will be established. Finally, he was forced. He married Hanzada Begim to the Khan and departed with 200 persons on foot. So with Hanzada Begim depicted as giving herself up through marriage, and Babur finally obtaining allegiance and the necessary troops he needed to build his empire, Gulbadan reminds us that sacrifices from both men and most importantly women were necessary for the creation of the Mughal Empire. So she's able to redefine kingship as determined by Mughal female symbols of sacrifice embodied by Hanzada Begum. In fact, Babur actually conferred the title of Padishah Begum, Lady King, and she was really the first lady of his empire after his death. Another important aspect of Javan Mardi is courage and prowess, which is symbolized by Haram Begum. So she's characterized in this manner. Tell our sister-in-law to equip and send the army to Badashan as quickly as possible. In only a few days, the Begum gave several thousand men horses and arms, outfitted and equipped them, and escorted them herself as far as the pass. From there, she dispatched them forward while she turned back. The army came and joined the emperor. Battle was fought with Mirza Khamran in Sharikaran or Karabagh. The emperor's forces were victorious and Mirza Khamran was defeated. So Humayun's sister-in-law is basically the first one he calls for when he needs military support, and she is the vital key with her military, prowess that enables Humayun to win his battle against Mirza Khamran, his rival for kingship. So with this very vivid description of Haram Begim's military prowess that is unique, Gulbadan Begum is able to assert the need for elite Mughal women to educate themselves in different places, from the harem to the court to the battlefield. Another characteristic of Javan Mardi is honesty that is seen by Haram Begim. So here she talks about this situation that Haram Begim was in. So Begi Aga wept and wailed, trying to coax the lady, saying, Mirza Khamran is in love with you, and yet you are unchivalrous to him. Haram Begim, revolted and disgusted, immediately sent for Mirza Suleiman and Mirza Ibrahim and said, Mirza Khamran must think you are cowards to send a letter to me. Do I truly deserve to be written to in this manner? Mirza Khamran is your elder brother, and I am his sister-in-law. Now he sends me such a letter. Arrest that woman and tear her to pieces, so that others will learn by her example and not have designs on the womanfolk of others. Immediately the guilty wretch, Behim Aga, was torn to pieces, and because of that, Mirza Suleiman and Mirza Ibrahim turned against Mirza Khamran. So according to Gulbadan, Mughal women upholding Javan Mardi should be revolted and disgusted by unwanted romantic advances made to them by men who are not their husbands, by also showing the violent outcome of Begim Aga, who was the one who tried to, persuade Haram Begim to cheat on her husband. She shows the fate of women when they break the code of Javan Mard, to exploit royal Mughal women with their evil designs. Moreover, by showing how Mirza Khamran lost his allies because of the way he tried to persuade sister-in-law to cheat, it shows the fate of Mughal women when they don't respect elite Mughal women. So ultimately, Mirza Khamran was blinded and lost his bid for kingship. So by redefining Javan Mardi through the Humayun-Nameh, I've shown that Javan Mardi does not simply belong to male, and it's not simply about masculinity. It's very much related, and it helps us rethink femininity. So another important aspect in the Humayun-Nameh is how it gives a space for androgyny. So here, by telling us of the characters of Shah Begim and Mirang's Begim. So Shah Begim, granddaughter of Sultan Hussein Mirza on her mother's side, and the Padishah's paternal aunt, Mirbazan Begim, daughter of Muzaffar Mirza and granddaughter of Sultan Hussein Mirza. They loved her very much, and they wore men's clothing and were adorned with all sorts of skills like craving, sigirs, polo playing, and archery. She also played many musical instruments. So by showing how elite Mughal women were empowered by their lineages and were able to impose their own definitions of gender that redefines the Mughal court as a distinct place where gender ambiguity was given a place, Gulbadan Begum, our writer, is able to shatter notions of the feminine as being separate and unequal from the masculine. In fact, by having the personal freedom to cross-dress and publicly live with these kind of like androgynous identities, the Mughal women were actually more free than male counterparts who had to maintain, images of warriors and rulers to qualify for kingship one day. So by writing the Humayun-Nameh as a mirror for a princess, she's able to redefine politics, kingship, empire, warfare, and most importantly, Javan Mard as female. She asserts the needs for these women's skills to be passed down to other elite Mughal men and women with the Humayun-Nameh, which I argue is the first mirror for a princess's autobiography. So here I'd like to conclude that by looking at the Humayun-Nameh through the lens of Michel Foucault's counterhistory, I have provided new ways of thinking how overlooked texts are able to challenge dominant perceptions regarding the Mughal Empire and also Javan Mardi. With this, I hope to be able to motivate future memories based on women-centered forms of thinking and living that can help us better traverse the duplicities and multiplicities of power and dominance in order to better resist them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that wonderful talk. Let me check into the chat here for a moment. So I have a first question. In trying to use language to embody traits that they thought women should have, even if they mirrored that of men, do you think the androgyny you mentioned is ultimately a helpful or hurtful aim? This is from Jess Johnson.
Sorry, Madeline, I couldn't hear the question because my internet died. Do you mind repeating it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sorry.
No. In trying to use language to embody traits that they thought women should have, even if they mirrored that of men, do you think the androgyny you mentioned is ultimately a helpful or hurtful aim?
Oh, thank you for the question. So I think for me, is definitely a helpful aim because she basically shows there are different kinds of, femininity, involved. It's like, we tend to normally think, oh, playing polo and, dressing up as men simply belongs to the masculine domain, right? But here she shows, there are different kinds of femininity actually going on, and it challenges the way we see, sports playing as simply belonging to the masculine domain. So yes, thank you very much.
Well,
I hope that answered your question.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. And to build on that question, I have two others kind of that I hope that one of the things that you mentioned in the talk was that whereas you see that this full range of options being opened up to women, kind of things that we think of as traditionally female and what we think of as a traditionally male domain, that wasn't available to men of this period, that the kind of traditionally female characteristics would not have been culturally acceptable or encouraged. Could you talk a little bit more about that and where you see that and any additional thoughts you have on it?
Yeah, because for me, for example, to be a king, you have to basically perform the role of a specific ruler, right? You have to be brave, you have to be masculine, and you have to be, dominating in a way too, right? But here, you can see that the women had more, more freedom to live both identities, right? Or even create their own new kind of identity. So I think, for example, we can see Emperor Babur, who, these men spent their whole lives, riding across, plains and mountains, and there are lots of brothers trying to fight for one single position, right? So they had to show, okay, I'm a brave warrior. That's what makes me qualified to rule. And the funniest thing is because the Mughals were descended from the Timurids, right? And we know that Timurid, he wasn't really, the direct descendant of Genghis Khan. He called himself the son-in-law, right? So the only way he could legitimize his rule was by marrying into Genghis Khan's family, right? So the whole identity the idea of masculinity is very much dependent on some sort of feminine or female connection. So that's how I saw it.
I'm checking for any more. If you in the audience have any more questions and answers, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box. And I had another question, actually precisely building on your answer there. You mentioned that the imperial ideology, the justification, the legitimacy of the Mughal Empire came through this notion of the connection through the female line. And I don't have a lot of background in this area. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that was performed in imperial ideology, in the stories, in the pageantry?
Sure. Here I'm going to go back to my original slide to see about this idea of okay. So basically, the Mughal women are seen as descended from the Mughal Empire itself. Actually, is descended from the mythical sun goddess Elangoa. So basically, all their legends speak of a goddess, giving birth to the Mongol Empire, which is how the Mongols used to legitimize themselves. So we're descended from the Mongols, and we're descendants of Genghis Khan. That's why we are fit to rule. And the Mongols were actually a minority, because they're part of the Persianate culture. They're ruling over a majority a Hindu population, right? So there's lots of ways that Mughal women were very much important, because they supplied the bloodlines, they produced heirs, that were needed to continue the empire, right? So yeah, definitely I think, and also you can imagine the Emperor Humayun himself never wrote his own autobiography. So, and her nephew basically asked his aunt, hey, can you come and write a text for me? And she grudgingly, we can see through the text later on that she grudgingly said, okay, I'm just, she complains a little bit, but later, and she's able to complain to it and say, I'm doing this as a favor, this kind of she obviously is a very unique woman who has her own mindset, and she's not afraid to actually speak out her mind directly. So I think that in itself shows the way Mughal women were very much, powerful, right? I hope I answered your question. Sorry, I kind of
No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your talk. We're going to move on to our next talk here. Our next presenter is Julie Ershadeh. Julie is a third-year graduate student in the program of Iranian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. And the paper that she'll be presenting today is entitled Self-Rewriting in Ghazal Poetry, Experimenting with Meter, Rhyme, and Imagery in the 14th Century. Please join me in, well, no, not in welcoming her because we can't hear the applause, but in imagining the applause for this exciting talk.
Thank you, everyone. I'm actively imagining your applause for my presentation, and I appreciate all of it. I will share my screen, and while I complete that act, I just want to mention how much I appreciate the previous presentations, especially the one that we've just listened to. Extremely interesting content, and frankly, I can't wait to see where the research of myself and my colleagues goes in the future. Can someone indicate that they can see my shared screen?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see my cursor? Whoa.
Yes, that also.
Okay. Excellent. Well, let's start then. I am presenting on the work of a female poet who was active in 14th century Shiraz, which is in the Fars province of southern modern day Iran, because her collected works demonstrates certain interesting peculiarities, specifically this kind of really consistent pattern of poems that are extremely similar, so similar that we, certain scholars, myself included, feel confident in referring to these as like related poems or poems that essentially are drafts of each other, or they have some kind of drafting relationship between them. It's not the amount of similarities between them is not coincidental, and this is somewhat unusual, especially the sheer volume of poems that fall into this category within her collected works. It's unusual to see so many. So my efforts right now concentrate on trying to understand whatever we can from this observation. So, but in the interest of as inclusive and engaging a conversation as possible, I wanted to start with a much broader question, which is obviously related to the idea, but it's this question of what constitutes good poetry. So I study poetry, the ghazal or lyric love poetry of pre-modern Persianate cultures. And so we only have limited evidence of Persian poets grappling with how to improve their craft. There is occasional indirect mention of this process in the few style manuals that were written in the pre-modern period. One of them is the Tarjuman al-Balagha, and another text extremely similar, in fact, kind of borrowed from it, we might say. حدائق في السحر في دقائق الشعر, as well as the Mu'jam by Shams Qais. These two previous ones were at the beginning and the end of the 11th century, and then the Mu'jam by Shams Qais is from the 13th century. But these are just three almost isolated style manuals, at least, to use that anachronistic term. As for commentary on the matter from poets themselves, we are obliged to look much harder at other specific, for example, we can try to look for clues in self-referential lines within poems that we do have from all kinds of different poets. and we only occasionally catch glimpses of the trajectory of their artistic development. Part of the problem for this, for those who aren't familiar with kind of some of the conventions of Persian poetry, many poets' works are collected into a collected works known as a divan, and since at least the 11th century, excuse me, since I believe at least the 12th century, divans have been organized alphabetically as opposed to chronologically. So we run into this issue where, you know, because there's so little historical record surrounding beyond like broad strokes biographical information about poets, some of which may not even be reliable. We can't really know like when a certain poem was written, how, and therefore we run into a lot of obstacles when we try to study stylistics and the evolution thereof, either on an idiosyncratic level with just one individual poet, as I'm doing here, or you know, on a more diachronic scale. So that said, rarely, it should be clear by now, rarely do we find as clear examples of a poet working on their craft as in the case of Jahan Melek Khatun, who is the poet that I've been referring to. So, you know, we have some just broad biographical strokes about her. Her divan contains 1,400 ghazals, many of which demonstrate a considerable degree of overlap in terms of rhyme structure and whole lines in some cases. So I started looking at this poet following the observation of Dominic Parviz Brookshaw in his 2005 article, which is the one quoted in that first bullet point. We have you know, textual evidence that she had an active engagement at the courts of her uncle, Sheikh Abū Ishaq, who died in 1357 AD, as well as later monarchs, including SHAH, who died in 1384. She enjoyed a rapport with the Jalairid court in Baghdad as well. I provide this information just to show that she was not kind of like in a corner by herself writing. She exhibited a quite unusual degree of public life. And again, as relates to our previous talk, the reasons for her greater degree of public involvement you know, probably derive from the influence of the ruling, the origins of the ruling class, which at this point was the Injuids, who are ultimately of Mongol ancestry. And we know that Mongol kind of cultural norms were more open in terms of female agency than the Persianate cultural norms that had dominated this region up to this time. So this is one area that I'm studying further at this time, but I can at least comment on it now. We have 4 known manuscripts of hers, which, you know, can be seen as another example of her it indicates something about her significance. It's up for debate exactly what, but there's 1 at Cambridge, 1 in Istanbul, and 2 in Paris. So, you know, compared to her contemporary Hafez, who we've mentioned here, he has like thousands of manuscripts out that were produced and vastly circulated. So, you know, it's a much lower survival rate in terms of these documents that record Jahan's writings. but at least one of these is a royal manuscript, which meaning it was commissioned by a royal patron, which itself may suggest, perhaps that the interest in her poetry existed in certain circles and perhaps not others. Moving on from these ideas, we're going to see soon, I will show an example of two poems that strongly demonstrate this kind of revision hypothesis that I'm working with. But we can first explore the question of like, why would she revise in the first place? Or more specifically, why would she include these multiple versions of her poems in her divan, where most poets typically, at least the evidence suggests, right, that they would kind of cull down their poems and only include the most the ones that they would have considered the best in terms of stylistics and aesthetics. I speak as if the poets put together their own divans, but this is often not even the case. So it's a much more complex question than I'm presenting it as, but for the sake of time, we'll at least look at it this way, and we can get further into it during the Q&A if we like. She wrote a brief but revelatory introduction to her divan, which may shed some light on the question of why she revised her poems and included multiple versions. So, she asked her male contemporaries for input on the quality of her lines in this introduction. She refers to herself in this request as a za'ifeh, obviously deriving from the Arabic, and meaning a weak person. It's a kind of a form of performative humility, again, as we heard about so eloquently in the previous talk. So perhaps she included these draft poems, as I call them lately, as if to say, here are my drafts. Let me know which you think is better. Perhaps I can learn something more about this craft of writing poetry. This may be suggestive of a kind of self-consciousness, which wouldn't be far-fetched in the context of her acknowledgement of the taboo that she is breaking. So she does have a section as well in this introduction where she says, I never would have put pen to paper until I learned for myself that there are great women of Islam, great Muslim sisters who themselves have written poetry in the past. And she goes on to quote some of these lines, again, in a very coy fashion that is both a demonstration of her point, but also potentially a preemptive defensive remark. It's also entirely possible that she included multiple different variations on a certain kind of poetic theme because she thought they were both good. This wouldn't be totally out of the ordinary, but again, referring back to like the sheer volume, remember she has 1,400 poems, and in my experience of perusing the divan for the past like year or so, it is to the extent that if a poem is unique, that is actually kind of out of the norm. So most of her poems are in these like kind of groups together, but we'll see that soon. So now we can kind of think about, we've looked at why, now we can look at, okay, well, what do these revisions actually, what do these versions of poems look like? What is an indication that two poems are kind of genetically linked? And why we would ask this is that this question has the potential to teach us a great deal about the stylistic and aesthetic norms that she and her contemporaries would have been working towards, especially if we want to say, as many scholars do, that the 14th century represents kind of the height of the Ghazal Golden Age. We want to be very careful about what that means and our ability to define that. So we have some criteria, I guess we might say, or some kind of markers that that I have observed in reading her works and determining the similarity of various poems. So the first would be on the basis of formal considerations in terms of meaning the structure of the poem. So both poems have almost all the same rhyme and the same, almost all the same rhyme words and the same refrain. There are the first and last lines are often the same or extremely similar. And then within this mix, 2 or more images, phrasings, or entire lines, besides the first and last, are also the same. So you can almost visualize there's like the beginning of the poem is the same, the end of the poem is the same, the refrain of the poem is the same. So on the end of each line, for both versions, it looks very similar. And then somewhere in the middle, there's also some overlap. We'll see this, I think, in the next slides. So let's take a look at that. I'm not sure how many Persian readers we have with us, so I will show this briefly, and then I will move on to my my terrible English translations, so that we can have a as inclusive a conversation as possible. I won't read the poems. I don't think I have time to do that, but let's, if we may, just take a look at the color coding that I've instituted. So we can see, we can make some observations just very broadly. So the first thing we might observe is that there are many lines that are paired between the 2 versions of these poems. Feel free to read the poems as I talk. Again, I wish that I could read them, but I trust you to enjoy them for yourselves. Again, we see kind of a similar, as I indicated in the previous slides, the last-ish lines are very similar. The first lines in both poems are very similar. We see, if we look at the yellow and the green color-coded lines, there is a great deal of, and again, there's much more to say and more specifics in terms of like lexicosyntactic similarities, the kind of massaging of imagery to perhaps fulfill certain aesthetic or stylistic goals. Again, this is all the content of my research, so it's not clear entirely right now, and I look forward to the discussion. But just to kind of wrap up our little preliminary analysis, these we see like kind of, we can say transposition of lines, like she moves things around. The imagery changes. For example, if we just very quickly look at line 5 in the first poem and line 3 in the second, we can see, I'll read them. The Joseph of our Egypt-like heart turned our heart to blood as soon as my distraught thoughts had returned to their peaceful abode. So we have Joseph, we have the heart, we have blood, we have distraught thoughts, we have this idea of a peaceful abode. Like, and then here, number 3 in 495, out of heartache, I had thrown all my trappings to the wind. My distraught thoughts returned to their protected abode again. So again, we hear kind of an echoing of these certain specific images and phrases, and I might say that the similarities are even more striking in the Persian due to, again, my my shameful translation. So I would love to keep talking. However, I will move on to people's questions. I offer some questions to just kind of bear some vulnerability and show these are my questions about this project, this paper up to this time. And I look forward to anyone else's input as we continue this wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, particularly those 2 very interesting poems and this whole corpus of literature that clearly I'm very excited to see what you end up writing about this. So I am turning to the chat here, and please write in your questions if you have them. I'd like to start with a question of my own. One interesting difference between these two poems that you have up on the page right now, it seems like poem 494 is playing with the Joseph story, of weaving the Joseph story in as part of, we've got Jacob and Canaan and Joseph, as well as that reference to Layla and Majnun in the purple. And then the next poem deals with a lot of the same motifs, but leaves out that dynamic. Is this something that you see repeatedly in these poems, that the variation will involve adding an extra image or an extra intertextual link? Is that one of the patterns that our poetess is playing with potentially?
It's an extremely interesting question. This very keen observation of yours is not a pattern that I have seen consistently among the corpus of poems that fall into this kind of revision category, enough that I would kind of, for example, make it another criterion as we looked at on this slide. However, it is a factor in why I selected these two poems to analyze for the article. So what is so interesting about your observation, if I may, is that the use of the imagery in 494 impacts the kind of semantic resonance of certain lines, if I can find it. There's a line, I can't believe I can't find it in these 9 lines, but there's a line where Joseph's collar is mentioned, or the scent of the scent of his collar comes toward the world. So if we look at line 4, there's no mention of Joseph or Jacob or Canaan or Egypt or any of that kind of that kind of allegorical imagery. But because it's all throughout the rest of the poem, the semantic range of the word collar, because of the role of his shirt in the story, becomes kind of confined to that, or if you like, expanded into that direction. Whereas there's mention of the beloved's collar. The messenger came and brought a scent from my beloved's collar. In 495, the version that has no detectable allegorical, excluding Layli and Majnun, no allegorical link to the Joseph and Jacob story. So this is kind of an excellently compact demonstration of the semantic flexibility of stock imagery in Persian poetry. So that is my answer to your question.
Wonderful. I have a number of other questions from the chat, so I'll put my own aside for the moment. Okay. Benjamin Rangel is asking, is this idea about self-facsimile common to other poets in the Persianate tradition, or specific to the poet that you were working on? And well,
I would love to ask for clarification on the term self-facsimile, but
actually, I think, Benjamin, if you could unmute yourself, would you be willing to tell us more about what you're imagining here?
I guess just, like intertextuality with the self, or just kind of engaging. It's what I was understanding you to say about replication and sort of facsimile or refashionings of previous texts. And is that like a phenomenon you see with other poets, or is it something limited to her?
Thank you for your question, Benjamin. As I kind of like alluded to in an earlier slide, they're like sometimes, but as I kind of keep saying, the extent to which we observe it in her works, in her divan, is extremely unusual, and it raises a lot of. So one kind of meta observation that I can make is that given that Jahan is a female poet, the question of her gender, and she herself discusses her gender in her introduction and alludes to it quite frequently in her poetry in very interesting ways that are outside the scope of at least this discussion. So when we as scholars try to analyze her work, this question of her gender always becomes, it's kind of like always the elephant in the room in any conversation about her, for better or worse. And so there's like this kind of temptation to say, like, well, maybe, you know, because she was, you know, since she says in her introduction, I'm a woman, and I know I'm stepping out of line a little bit. I ask for feedback from, you know, the men around me, the wise men around me, she says, who, for lack of a better term, like know what they're talking about. Perhaps this gender element is also kind of factors into why she would include so many versions of her poems where we really don't see the same thing happening with other poets. I allude here in this bullet point that the scholar Shafi Kadkani has pointed out that based on the evidence, Hafez, Jahan's contemporary and probably definitely one of the most famous Persian poets, produced multiple versions of a poem for different performative contexts. So like a Sufi gathering versus a more orthodox gathering versus a courtly setting. In my opinion, this possibility exists, but is limited for Jahan, again, based on gender considerations. So how much, how appropriate would it have been for a female poet to be going to Sufi majales and, you know, I don't know. I mean, there's more explanation that needs to be done in this area, but I hope that this has kind of clarified a little bit the fact that, like, it's not that common to see a poet producing self-facsimile or kind of self-referential intertextuality the way that she does.
I have another question from Amanda Leong, also kind of oriented towards the particular femaleness of our poet. She asked, does Jahan's poetry show influence from other earlier female poetesses and provide us with a better understanding of early female poetry tradition in the Persian context? Specifically in that introduction, are the women poets she's citing, are they from the Persian poetic tradition, the Arabic poetic tradition? Does she engage with them in anything beyond citing them as role models?
This is an extremely interesting question. It's not something, at least in the English language sources, I don't think it's something that's really been studied at all. So it's entirely possible, but this is an excellent question that I don't think anyone knows the answer to at this time. The female poets that she refers to in her introduction, at least one of them is of Arab origin, and there's at least one other in there who I believe is Iranian. There are other, or Persian, I should say, excuse me. There are other, there's at least one other poet, Persian, well, more than one, but the other kind of major well-known Persian female poet would be Mahsati, who wrote more in like the 9th, 10th century, mostly quatrains. But this is an excellent question. I think some kind of comparative look would be merited or warranted.
I have one final question and then we'll move on to the next paper. But to some extent, it's just a basic factual question. Is she before or after Jami wrote his his famous Yusuf the Zuleika poem. Because I couldn't help but notice, I taught it for a class once, and I couldn't help but notice that the version of the poem that brings in Yusuf also brings in the intoxication image, and you're talking about, you know, the Sufi majlis as a possible setting in which maybe she couldn't perform it, but someone could perform it. Would those things be linked in the mind of someone of her generation?
Jahan is pre-Jami.
Okay.
Yeah, he is a 15th century poet. No, but it's an excellent question. And the use of the Joseph and Jacob trope in Persian lyric poetry predates both of them by, let's say, at least a century.
Okay.
I could be making that number up. I completely apologize, but it predates both of them, and so it's a recurrent image. Your question about like the majlis and the drinking. Did you mention drinking?
There's the image of in one of these lines, in your blue line, we have the desire, the intoxicating wink, and I don't know whether that's actually translating, you know, words for like wine intoxication, but
it is.
And at least in Jami's poem, this image of wine intoxication linking with kind of a Sufi reading of the Joseph story gets woven together. So I just wasn't sure if those tropes were already linked, and if she's playing with a combination of them, or if she's linking them here.
In my experience, in my opinion, so to answer your question, yes, it is a drunkenness. It's the word mast, so it intoxicated or intoxicating in reference really to, you know, alcohol, wine, or any kind of alcohol intoxication. In my opinion, these two kind of stock images or tropes, you know, the intoxication of love for the beloved, and the story of Jacob and Joseph are both so commonplace in the lyric tradition that to seek a link, like an imagistic link between the two of them, I'm not saying that it like is completely implausible, but I would be surprised, just because they both come up so frequently that it didn't catch my attention that they were both there as like kind of a linked thing. It's just so common to say that the beloved's eye is intoxicating and intoxicated and sleepy, and, you know, these kinds of things. But thank you so much for that reference to Jami, and I'll certainly explore the question further.
No, thank you for this. My knowledge in this area is minute, so thank you for expanding it vastly, and thank you for a wonderful paper. I'm so excited to see where a lot of this research goes. This is marvelous stuff. All right, to turn to our final paper. Our very last presenter, but by no means the least, staying with our in the poetic realm for a moment, is Benjamin Rangel. Benjamin Rangel is a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, and he'll be presenting today a paper entitled "Choose a Language Like a Wedding Ring: Polysystems, Norms, and Pseudo-Translation in Leah Goldberg's Poetry and Prose." Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Madeline. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Those were wonderful presentations. I'm going to be also speaking about a female poet, Leah Goldberg, like the previous presentation, but I'm going about several centuries into the future from there. Are you guys seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and view. And let's see. Okay, I'm actually speaking about just one poem, not in all prose and poetry, and I'm just going to speak about polysystems, not pseudo-translation and norms, which is kind of part of my larger project for this. But basically, I want to speak a little bit just freely about Leah Goldberg and give you guys an introduction about why she's so important to me in my research, and say a little bit about polysystems. Polysystems are just, it's like it's a theory from Itamar Ibn Zohar, post-structuralist, kind of thinking about culture and literature in terms of systems that overlap, that yeah, it's a little bit out of fashion now. It's really important for translation studies. Yeah, it doesn't come up a ton outside of translation theories. So Leah Goldberg, she's one of modern Hebrew literature's most iconic and prolific figures. Maybe not always, like, she's not so well known outside of Israel. You know, she's mainly known for her translations for poetry. She did drama and prose too, one of those types, and she was a scholar. You know, she doesn't have like a big prose piece that was translated into a Western language, so not everyone is always familiar with her, but so she's from Lithuania, and she was very multilingual. She had a childhood that was very itinerant, growing up around the First World War. You know, and the end of the 19th century and early 20th century is kind of the end of this Eastern European multilingual Jewish world, where you're going to have someone like Leah Goldberg, who, of course, spoke Lithuanian, read Russian. She did her doctorate in Germany. So she had all of those languages, but like she also, well, she did her PhD work was about ancient Semitic languages. So she had, of course, Hebrew, and then all of the exegetical tradition in the Talmud, everything leading up to the medieval period and the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. All of that was sort of part of her purview. And then, of course, you just add Yiddish on top of that. You add other Western European languages that she knew. It's pretty astonishing how many languages she worked in. And so she was a Hebraist living in Germany. She finished her PhD at like the age of 21. She's in Bonn, 1933, publishes her first volume of poetry called Tabaot Ashan, Smoke Rings. And it had a warm reception in the British Mandate of Palestine at that time among the modernists who were there. And so at 33, you may imagine in Germany, not a good place for her to be. So she takes off to the British Mandate, and she finds herself to be already quite popular there among the poets. So what's interesting, just to give some background too for folks about modern Hebrew literature, is that none of these poets are, like when I talk about Hebrew modernism, like Leah Goldberg or any of her contemporaries, none of them are native speakers of Hebrew. They're choosing to speak Hebrew for ideological, often reasons, which range from a variety of things. But yeah, this is kind of like it's already multilingual in the way that there are no like monolinguals of Hebrew at that time. And so translation, multilingualism, and all that are just inherently a huge part of what it's kind of in the genetics of modern Hebrew literature already. But she became a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and she was a scholar there for her death in 1970. So just to give you guys a little taste about like how many people and what kind of variety of literature she was working on and she translated, I just selected, like the emphasis here is actually selected list of translations. This is not by any means her complete list of authors she worked on. I have the Shakespeare picture here. But like, you have to remember a lot of this, some of this may be helping translations or relay translations, you know, like the Rumi, for example. I really don't think that she read Rumi in Persian, but she probably read him in German. And even the English literature, like I have knowing a little bit about her travels, I know that she never went to an English-speaking country, so I don't know. But that's not really the point. What's more important is that it's just so broad, and there are some, you know, especially from German literature, when you're translating German literature into Hebrew in the 40s, 50s, it's really controversial. She came under a really significant criticism from her colleagues about engaging not only with German literature at that time, just to do anything that was from the European diaspora was just a kind of a taboo. It was focusing on Hebrew, like kind of insular sort of nation building at that time. So yeah, that was controversial for sure. I am gonna get into the poem that I worked on itself. It's actually a poem cycle, Meshirei Hanachal, from songs, or shir is both song and poem. Meshirei Hanachal, from Songs of the River. And it's kind of like a little Whitman maybe there, but basically she's, it's a cycle with all of these different nature kind of characters, I call it. The one cycle I'm going to talk about today is The River Sings to the Stone. And I will read it in Hebrew and then leave this here and then read off the page and do kind of a close reading for the rest of my time. So it's right. So this is the title, the Nachal Shar Le'even, Makelat Kolot Ktanim, Paul Verlaine. Et ha'even nashakti, betzinat cholema, ki ani hamazmer vehi hadmama, ki hi hachida ve'ani hechad, ki shnenu koatznu menetzach echad. Et ha'even nashakti, et basara haboded, hi shvuat emonim, ve'ani haboged. Ani hacholef vehi hakayam, hi sodot habriya, vani gluyam. Ve'eda ki nagati balev ne'elam, ani hameshorer vehi ha'olam. And you'll see like the beginning with the epigraph, Paul Verlaine, it's just the way she started the poem, but that's exactly what that's kind of my entry point into my close reading. So I'll just read it off the page now. So in the poem cycle, from Songs of the River, the epigraph states, a choir of small voices, Paul Verlaine. Goldberg's literary language was Hebrew, so such an inscription is, of course, a translation from the French original. In the context of the poem, these small voices are different speakers in nature, a stone and a river. The Verlaine quotation is an appropriate entry point to the present study because it shows that Goldberg highlighted translation in her work, making it a representative feature in her poetics. The cycle's title describes the sound of a multifarious object. A river moves and flows and has no discernible center or governing force. Similarly, the epigraph evokes a choral atmosphere, not the articulations of a solo entity. Considering its historical context, Goldberg's opening line of multiplicity is a plea against the fascist dictators whose single voices tore the world apart in the Second World War. Oh, this poem's from 1948, by the way. The quotation can also be read as encouraging an openness to the variety of cultural lineages that preceded modern Hebrew literature, the nascent corpus to which Goldberg contributed. In the present study, I argue that translation as a literary device within her poems is evidence for this receptivity and this open posture to multiple voices. So conducting literature studies in the mode of polysystem theory shifts attention away from the individual texts that compose a system and focuses on the characteristics of the literary system itself. Addressing the broadest parameters of this definition, Eben Zohar calls the polysystem a system of various systems which intersect with each other and partly overlap, using concurrently different options, yet functioning as one structural whole, whose members are independent. Using the logic of this piece, Goldberg herself becomes the outlet, the translator of each of these characters' stories. As the elements of nature tell one another's tales, Goldberg creates a sensation that the verses correspond to translations that are becoming increasingly distant from the source text as the cycle transpires. And the literary lives of Goldberg's characters comprise their own polysystems, with a mutual exchange between them demonstrating Eben Zohar's notion of independence, or what he calls bilateral interference, which is within this, which is his term for influencing one another reciprocally. In Hebrew, as I mentioned, poem and song are expressed by the same word, shil, and from songs of the river suggests that the texts were wrested from a larger corpus, so that Goldberg is only the partial translator of the river's oeuvre. The preposition from allows for Goldberg's poem cycle to be read as synchronic moments of exposition amidst a large amount of material still left unexplored. Her verses are several momentary impressions of a changing entity, a river. And this incompleteness aligns with the idea that a target text is always only a partial representation of its source. When the reader's attachment to realism is suspended, when she believes that these could be indeed the testimonies of inanimate objects, Goldberg's chorus-like vision for Hebrew literature becomes evident. My reading of the poem cycle affirms Evan Notion's observation that polysystems are not articulated univocally, but have several centers and peripheries, and this in turn supports the view that Goldberg's vision for Hebrew literature was composite and drawn from a variety of sources. Noting Hebrew system of grammatical gender for non-human nouns is essential for reading this poem. The river, or Nachal, its grammatical gender is masculine, and the stone, Eben, is feminine. And so the scene of this lover river speaking in the first person about his stone beloved is then construed. This interaction between acoustic and silent subjects itself resembles translation's mechanics, because source texts are usually obscured and incomprehensible from the reader of translated text. In the opening stanza, non-auditory signals are rendered. I am the song, and she is the silence. And this illustrates Evan Zohar's notion of translation as a means of arbitrating which repertoire within the polysystem will be expressed. And I quote, "The polysystem constraints turn out to be relevant for the procedures of selection, manipulation, amplification, deletion, etc." Goldberg does not reveal exactly what the river exposes of the stones. The reader is left to imagine what original material or repertoire the stone may withhold. What is most important is that the stone remains silent, and thus Goldberg creates a scenario in which an amplification and a manipulation of the stone's testimony occurs. When these processes happen, Goldberg makes translation a theme, and this communicates to a reader that such a generative process of adding new voices to the national literature is, in fact, worthwhile. A translator enlivens the source text into something distinguishable to the intended audience. And the verse's final lines reinforce this idea of magnifying or amplifying silence into something altogether comprehensible. I knew I touched a heart made mute. I am the poet, and she the world. Goldberg's imaginative scenario calls to mind Evan Zohar's notion of bilateral interference, yet again, where the orator river's translation comes at the cost of touching or impacting the mute stone's world. And though the river's literary system is one of the one most obviously being affected here, because he's presenting new repertoires in his language, the stone system is not left undisturbed. These transactions exemplify the process of renewal that comes when setting out to voice or translate other literatures. As a source text is changed or touched in its new form, the process demands a great consideration about which text will be known internationally. The heart made mute can be read as the riches of international literature that remain untranslated for the Hebrew readership. Goldberg's speaker announces that I, or the river, am the poet, which is logical considering that, like the vicissitudes of a poet's expressive powers, a river is in constant ebb and flow. The poet speaker is translating the world of his lover, the stone, who stays still and motionless. The material that the poet has rendered audible represents world literature in Hebrew translation, along with the strength that comes with this reciprocity and the inevitable and regenerative experience of change and adaptation. Goldberg's career as a translator and a poet encouraged cosmopolitanism in an era more fixated on issues internal to Jews and the construction of national identity. And her choice of Hebrew as a literary idiom can be compared to a couple's decision to marry. A marital engagement is a commitment to a single person, and Goldberg was unrelentingly committed to developing Hebrew as a veritable modern language of literature. Like a marriage, Goldberg's commitment was not contingent upon place, but depended rather on actions and emotions. In the interwar years of when she first began writing, choosing Hebrew, a language previously defunct and debilitated in terms of international literary status, Goldberg was committed to reifying and resurrecting her chosen idiom. In the process, she proposed a mode for Hebrew reader to choose aesthetic language that looked beyond the Jewish literary liturgical tradition, rich as it may be. Hebrew was a common focal point around which Goldberg's efforts rallied international Jewry to choose literature and openness over the ugliness and trauma of their past. This literature was not the provincial folktales of the diaspora, but a formidable international idiom, one with the capacity to tell the great stories of human civilization. That's it. So, that's just about it. Thank you so much to all the JAGNES folks who put this conference on, and I'm excited if there are some questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful paper and for bringing the poetry of Leah Goldberg to us. This has been, I think this really fits beautifully with some of the other papers that have come before this. To get us started, as other questions pour in, I have a question about a line of the poem, if you'd be willing to pop it back up there, where she talks about you the stone as a vow of devotion, and I am a boged, I am a betrayer, which just struck me as very interesting. All of the other lines of the poem were filled with this kind of this warm celebration of the cosmopolitanism that you're talking about, the delight in bringing alive what is in this secret mute heart of this beloved stone. But that line seems to bring in something that is more painful in that relationship. What did you make of that line?
I don't know. I mean, you're talking about she, the vow of devotion.
Yeah.
And I, the betrayer.
Yeah, Venia Boged.
That's an amazing line. I hadn't really thought that much about that particular term, boged, like boged in this way, and it is negative. The betrayer, the traitor. I think I focused more on the beginning part in a different time when I was analyzing this in a different way. But I don't know.
I really loved your reading. I think your reading is very strong. I just think it's this little sliver of glass that's shoved in there also that maybe right. I don't know, brings in another dynamic that comes with translating, with opening up a language to outside eyes.
For sure. And yeah, like the river is cholef too, is always changing. And fickle, and I guess this translation here it says evanescent for cholef, but it's just changing. And I think that is it goes along with the boged. But I'm interested to know what you mean more like about translation and being a traitor. Maybe it is a bit like she's feeling misgivings about about turning to other national literatures. But yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Let me check the chat for other questions, and please, our audience, please feel free to. I'm not seeing anything at the moment, but I'll wait and see if we have. Aha, yes, from Amanda. How do you think that Leah Goldberg allows to rethink cosmopolitanism with her poetry from a, quote, Near East perspective that challenges this very Eurocentric view of cosmopolitanism?
That's a great question. Oh, was that the whole question?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's so glad you asked that, because it is very Eurocentric. That list I showed of Hebrew world literature, essentially, and go back to it, like. And I pulled a lot of my research about this has been from an anthology of poetry translated into Hebrew called Voices Near and Far. And so the near ones are, of course, the European ones, and the far ones are Central Asian and East Asian poetry, which, again, these are the ones that I don't think she had the philological background to really approach. But but using a helping translation is not a big deal. I'm just pointing that out. As far as making the issue of cosmopolitanism, it's just a kind of a step to look beyond Hebrew for the high literary figures in the modern Hebrew literature scene. It's definitely not all encompassing, or it was just kind of like, yeah, that moment, but she didn't have a lot of background on non-European literature. I hope that answers the question.
No, absolutely. Let me see if there's any final. I think those are. I don't see any final questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your paper, and to all of the panelists today for some really wonderful scholarly contributions and some really thought-provoking contributions. I will turn this with no further ado back over to the wonderful JAGNES organizers who made all of this possible, and invited us all here.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for those papers. Those were incredibly fascinating. We at JAGNES want to extend our sincerest thanks to all of you who have participated today, the panelists and the moderators. We know that the pandemic has put new time constraints on all of us, on all of our time and energy. So thank you so much for using that here to develop new conversations and engage with fruitful points of comparison between our diverse areas of study. And like Madeline said, a huge thank you to the JAGNES board who organized this conference and are here today. It is through forums such as these in which a new generation of scholars come together that we can move our field into new areas and provide opportunities for rich cross-fertilization. Today, we've seen from models of intertextuality to analysis of cultural memory and constructions of gender. We've seen that across the time and space of the Near Middle East. Our commonalities as humanists and our intersecting questions have enormous potential for mutual illumination of our fields. Just on the JAGNES side, in terms of the rest of the academic year, we have some plans in the work for another opportunity to come together in the spring. So we hope that you'll join us then, and stay tuned for the JAGNES announcements via Facebook and our website. In the meantime, JAGNES has just put out an issue of our journal, so please visit our website and take a look at that. As co-editors-in-chief, Jess and I are excited to take the lead in guiding this organization through this very unique moment in time. We want to keep providing high-quality resources for students in both our department and across the field. We look forward to continuing to learn from each other and to explore new avenues of research. So thank you again to everybody who participated today, and we will see you hopefully in the spring.
Thank you, everybody.